Welcome to Hot Mess History. I'm your Hot Mess historian, Janet, and today we're going to be doing the first of a 6-part series on King Henry VIII and his 6 wives. So this video, of course, we're going to be talking about Katherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. Katherine was born in Spain in 1482. Her mother was Isabella of Castile, and her father was Ferdinand of Aragon. Now, these names may sound familiar. That's because these are the 2 monarchs that actually funded Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World. Katherine was actually betrothed to Prince Arthur of England from the age of 4. Now, this was actually pretty common practice of the day in order to secure alliances. The alliance between Spain and England was a very big political deal at the time because it was going to unite and ally 2 major powers of Europe of the day. Katherine spent most of her youth being educated in the ways of being a queen. She was taught how to run a very large household on her own because that was the queen's responsibility at the time. She was also very educated in the Catholic faith. Katherine was always a very devout Catholic. Katherine witnessed her mother going to war with the Moors for most of her childhood. Isabella was a fierce warrior. There are some reports, whether they're true or not, I don't know, but there have been reports that Isabella actually rode into battle while pregnant. She always remained true to her Catholic faith, and Katherine absorbed those lessons in courage, bravery, going to combat for what you believe in, and of course, staying true to the Catholic faith. Katherine journeys from Spain to England in 1501 and marries Prince Arthur on November 14th of 1501. Unfortunately, just 5 short months later, Prince Arthur died of what was called the sweating sickness. Now remember, her marriage to Prince Arthur was politically critical to the time period. So she had been ingrained and indoctrinated of how important it was for her to become the English queen. How can she become the English queen if Prince Arthur has died? She is now a widow. Katherine remembers the courage and strength from her mother and decides, I am going to be Queen of England. And she turns her eyes on Prince Arthur's brother, Prince Henry, who is to be the new heir to the English throne. King Henry VII, who is the King of England at the time, disagreed wholeheartedly with the proposed marriage from Katherine for her to wed his son Henry. It's a little confusing, there's a lot of Henrys. One of the major practices of the time is that when a woman is betrothed to a man, the woman's parents are to pay a dowry to the groom's family. Now, when Katherine married Arthur, there was a dowry paid to England for her marriage. After Arthur's passing, there is a dispute about the dowry that would be paid if Katherine were to marry Prince Henry. Spain is saying, look, we've already paid you 1 dowry for her marrying 1 son. So either allow them to marry with no additional dowry or send her original dowry and her back to Spain. Now, Henry VII does not like that ultimatum, and he decides, you know what? I'm just going to string them along. I'm not going to send back the money because I've already spent it, and I'm not going to pay them my own money. They were married. I'm also not going to allow her to marry my other son. I personally believe that he was just holding out because he wanted more cash. And Henry wound up keeping Katherine in England essentially as a prisoner, kind of under house arrest. She wasn't allowed to live at the palace. She had to live in sort of an abbey, I guess you could say. She was not really given much money to live off of, so she certainly was not living in the style in which she had been accustomed to, having grown up as a princess and the future Queen of England. Now, as this is going on, I mean, this is a time period of, we're talking about 7 years after Arthur dies, that this debate about whether she can marry Henry or not is happening. Now, over those 7 years, Henry and Katherine are exchanging letters, and they really are developing this bond and this connection. Henry was always a lover of courtly romance and just always romanticizing things, and so he really fed into that forbidden love and exchanging those hidden love letters. Henry and Catherine were ultimately married on June 11th of 1509. This marriage was only able to take place after the death of the King of England, Henry VII, and after receiving special dispensation from the Pope. The reason special dispensation was needed from the Pope is because Catherine had been married to Arthur, Henry's brother. And in the eyes of the church, that made them brother and sister. Now, in order to get around that, Catherine had to testify to the Pope that she remained a virgin. Despite her marriage to Prince Arthur, it was never consummated, therefore they were never actually legally married. And that is what allowed Henry and Catherine to be married. The first 5 years of Catherine and Henry's marriage were actually what you would call idyllic, considering the concept of a successful marriage between monarchs of the day. She served as his closest advisor and confidant. She served as the ambassador to Spain for those first 5 years. That's a huge accomplishment, particularly for a woman in that day and age. She was a passionate advocate for the poor and destitute, and she would provide them with food, clothes, and money during the winter months, fuel when they didn't have anything to heat their homes. And like her mother, Catherine did not shy away from combat. She fought off a Scottish rebellion by herself when Henry was actually fighting a war in France. So she was leading those troops. Again, not something that is particularly common in that time period. I know Isabella was doing it, but England had not really had a female monarch that was taking those reins and going into combat. Over the years of their marriage, Catherine would bear 6 children for Henry. Unfortunately, 5 of whom would die either being stillborn or shortly after birth. Their only surviving child was a girl, Princess Mary, who would later become known as Bloody Mary. Henry, like most monarchs, if not all monarchs, had an obsession with having a boy. They had to have a male heir to carry on the legacy and the crown. That was their method of securing their dynasty. As the years went on, and after each stillbirth or the child dying shortly after being born, Henry becomes more and more and more concerned and worried about not having a legitimate male heir. I use the term legitimate male heir because as those years were progressing and his worry was progressing, Henry took up with multiple mistresses. As the years went by, he became less and less subtle about it, almost flaunting it at some points, not really trying to hide the relationships at all. One of his more famous mistresses, Elizabeth Blount, gave birth to his son. Now, because she's a mistress, they're not married, it is an illegitimate son, but this went to prove to Henry almost that it was Catherine's fault that she couldn't have a son. I mean, here was this mistress, born out, having a child out of wedlock, but it's a boy. Why can't my legal wife provide me with a son? Something must not be right, and it has to be her because I can produce sons. By March 1526, Henry had decided once and for all, it wasn't him, it was the marriage. It's been cursed, they were never supposed to be married, and it's being proven by the fact that he cannot have a son. His wife will not be able to produce a son. It's cursed by God, there's no way that this could be blessed. It's also important to note that at this particular juncture, Henry has been introduced to one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting by the name of Anne Boleyn. Henry actively pursued Anne in trying to recruit her, I guess you could say, into being his next mistress, but Anne flatly denied him. She said, absolutely not, I am not going to be a mistress, I will be your queen or I will be nothing. Faced with Anne's ultimatum, this is when Henry decides he's finally going to take action. He writes to the Pope stating that he wants an annulment. He wants his marriage to Catherine to be null and void, and he cites a religious text in order to support his claim for the annulment. And if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He has uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. It's important to remember that the Catholic Church during this particular time in history was receiving a lot of direction and pressure from Charles V. He was the King of Spain, noted as the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was actually Catherine's nephew. The Pope received Henry's request and sent it to the ecclesiastical court for review to determine if an annulment would be appropriate or not. However, after receiving some pressure from Charles V, that court decides that they're going to postpone the review and put it off. They're not going to make a decision. They're going to bide their time and wait for more direction from Charles V. Charles encouraged this because he believed that Henry would just continue with his pattern. He would lose interest in Anne Boleyn and then go back to Catherine just as he had always done in the past. Throughout all of this, Catherine stands firm. She maintains her position of being a virgin when she married Henry and is adamant that their marriage was in fact blessed by God. With the delays coming from the Catholic Church, Henry is trying every single possible avenue that he can conceive to rid himself of Catherine. He benevolently offered to allow Catherine to retire and live the rest of her life in a nunnery, quietly in the service of God. Henry believed that this would be an enticing avenue for Catherine because she was such a devout Catholic. What Henry wasn't counting on was Catherine's stubbornness, formidable strength, and fighting constitution that she had inherited from her mother, Isabella. As a devout Catholic, Catherine considered she and Henry married. Full stop. End of. You are my husband. We are blessed by God. We were married in a church. I don't know what you're talking about. Unfortunately for Catherine, Henry's desire to be rid of her as a wife was far stronger than her beliefs that they were married. After waiting for 7 years for confirmation from the Pope that their marriage is null and void, 7 years. That's how long they waited to get married. Henry decides to convene his own court, which is stacked heavily against Catherine. Everyone he's put on in the court to make that decision is very pro-Henry and very anti-Catherine. Sometime between 1532 and 1533, Henry actually had Catherine banished from court and moved Anne Boleyn into the Queen's rooms. In addition to being banished from the court, Catherine was stripped of all of her formal titles and from then on was required to be addressed as Dowager Princess, which would have been her ranking and title if she had not remarried and simply remained widowed after the death of Prince Arthur. In addition to that, she was exiled from her daughter. She was not allowed to have any contact with Mary and never saw her again. The separation from Catherine and Mary would actually affect Mary's life forever, and it affected her relationship not only with her father, but with her other siblings as well. The English courts officially declared Catherine and Henry's marriage null and void on March 30th, 1533. Despite being removed and exiled from not only court but her daughter, Catherine remained strong and adamant. She maintained her position on the status of her marriage as being valid in the eyes of God and law. She continued to refuse to acknowledge anyone that referred to her as Princess Dowager. She would only answer to being called Queen Catherine or Your Majesty. She died at Kimbledon Castle on January 7th, 1536, at the age of 50. Sadly, it's reported that upon hearing the news of her death, Henry held a massive banquet and dressed himself head to foot in gold and yellow and treated it as a celebration. After Catherine gave him 24 years of loyal marriage and did her best to be a loving wife and provide everything she could to her husband, he threw her aside because he found somebody younger, newer, and just decided that he didn't want to have Catherine anymore. Thanks for watching. As always, if you have any recommendations for any new topics or content, just leave a comment below. We'll see if we can get to it. Don't forget to like and subscribe for new and updated content. See you next time.